At the end of the 20th century, as the Soviet Union rapidly unraveled with Gorbachev's reforms allowing for rights of protest and freedom of expression, member states adopted acts of sovereignty and independence. In January 1990, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to streets demanding independence. The following July, the Parliament of Ukraine approved legislation declaring sovereignty, and in August 1991, the parliament declared independence. The legislation was ratified by 92% Ukrainians later in December, while chairman of the parliament Leonid Kravchuk was simultaneously appointed the president of the new state. People had expected the state to improve economy and quality of life, as the reallocation of resources and transfer of wealth from Ukraine to other parts of the Soviet Union were to finally stop. However, independence did not immediately reap the expected results, as the early years were marked by deep recession and hyperinflation, which wiped out 60% of the country's GDP and resulted in five-digit inflation. Ukraine's currency was devalued severely, and unemployment numbers soared across the country. This caused President Leonid Kravchuk to lose out to Leonid Kuchma in 1994's presidential election. Kuchma introduced expensive economic reforms, introducing a new currency, cutting down on subsidies, lowering taxes, and altogether moving the country towards a freer economy. Initially, he also pushed for stronger relations with the West, angling for European Union and NATO memberships. However, he also didn't want to sour relations with Russia altogether, participating in talks with Commonwealth of Independent States and making Russian an official language. After his re-election, Kuchma was caught up in a string of corruption scandals that evaporated his popularity. Leaked tapes from Kuchma's office that were recorded by his bodyguard seemed to substantiate the charges against him. Protests ensued in 2004 when a closely contested presidential election between Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych, who Kuchma had endorsed, was declared in favor of Yanukovych, but allegations and perceptions of systematic rigging prevailed. The focal point of these protests was the Ukrainian capital Kiev, and they were termed as the Orange Revolution. During the campaign, Yushchenko's health had deteriorated, which disfigured his face. This later turned out to be dioxin poisoning. The Supreme Court ruled the 2004 election results invalid and ordered another runoff in which Yushchenko prevailed over his rival. After assuming office, Yushchenko had to deal with stiff dissent from multiple prime ministers, including his rival Yanukovych, who was appointed as prime minister after the 2006 parliamentary elections. After calling for three elections that failed to give him the parliamentary support he wanted, uncertainty and chaos had eroded Yushchenko's political capital, and his rival Yanukovych ascended to power in the 2010s presidential election. Yanukovych, long considered to be pro-Russian, moved to improve relations with Ukraine's eastern neighbor, first abandoning Ukraine's goal to join NATO, and then in 2013 bowing out of signing association agreement with the European Union. However, this proved to be the beginning of the end for Yanukovych, as widespread protests soon broke out. Unlike Orange Revolution, these demonstrations, termed as Maidan Movement, turned out to be violent, and as the situation deteriorated, Yanukovych fled the country. A series of conflicts sprung up in eastern Ukraine, and in 2014 the Crimean parliament voted to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. Russia quickly moved in to annex the region. Meanwhile, the rest of the country prepared for a presidential election which saw Ukrainian billionaire Petro Poroshenko ascend to power. Poroshenko's tenure was marked primarily by brewing conflict in eastern Ukraine and the resulting confrontation with Russia. His reputation was also hit by Panama Papers, which unveiled that the candy company Roshen that he had originally promised to sell was in fact transferred to British Virgin Islands, which meant that he had not only failed to deliver on a campaign promise, but also potentially avoided taxes in the process. Despite this, Poroshenko might have secured a second term had it not been for Volodymyr Zelensky's wildcard campaign. A former actor who played the popular role of an accidental president in a sitcom, swept to power in a landslide victory in the 2019 presidential election. As one of his campaign promises, Zelensky focused on de-escalating the conflict in eastern Ukraine by signing a truce that stipulated the withdrawal of both Ukrainian and Russian troops from the Donbas region and the recognition of election results. Tensions persisted, however, and in 2021, as Russia started building up its troops on the Ukrainian border, Zelensky called on the West to support Ukraine militarily and speed up its membership request for NATO. In February 2022, as the Russian president ordered his troops in, calling it a special operation, Zelensky declared martial law and vowed to fight, turning down Western offers to evacuate and the Russian demand of surrender. Once a presidential candidate for peace, Zelensky assumed the role of a wartime president with surprising vigor.